Welcome back. On this lecture, we will calculate the return on equity for Apple and Microsoft. On this slide, we will calculate the return on equity ratio for Apple. So, what is the return on equity and why is it important? To start, the return on equity measures how effectively management is using a company's equity to create profits. One item to highlight is that this ratio is largely dependent on the industry and sectors that a company operates in. For example, investors can consider a return of equity ratio above 15% to be acceptable, whereas less than 10% would be a poor return on equity. So how is this ratio calculated? The return on equity ratio is calculated as net income divided by the average total equity of the company. Let's do this for Apple. We'll start with net income, which was $57.4 billion in 2020. And then we'll take the average equity, which comes up to around $77.9 billion for 2020 and 2019. When we take the net income of $57.4 billion over the average equity of $77.9 billion, we come up with a return on equity ratio of around 73.7. So what does this mean for Apple? Well, this tells us that with equity of $100, Apple is able to generate a profit of around 73.7%. Overall, this is a really high return on equity by Apple. Now on this slide, we'll calculate the same ratio for Microsoft. We'll use the same formula by taking net income over average equity. And for Microsoft, we have net income of $44.3 billion. We then calculate an average equity balance of $110.3 billion for fiscal year 2020 and 2019. When we take the net income balance of $44.3 billion over the average equity amount of $110.3 billion, we come up with a return on equity of around 40.14. So what does this mean, and how does it compare to what we saw earlier from Apple? Here, we can see that equity of $100, Microsoft is able to generate a profit of around 40.1%. Similar to Apple, this is a really good ratio, which reflects a good return on equity by Microsoft. To put this in perspective, however, we can see that Apple's return on equity of almost 74% is much higher than the 40% return on equity by Microsoft. In this case, the advantage would go to Apple for this return on equity metric.